So the outermost of the moons is Callisto. The second outermost moon is Ganymede. So that gives us the outermost and second outermost. The two innermost moons, the innermost one is Io and the next one is Europa. So we're going from outwards to in. Previous lecture talked about Callisto, then Ganymede. So the next one is Europa. When Voyager 2 looked at Europa, they were like surprised. They did not see craters. There's like something that looks like a crater right there, but everything else had craters all over it. There was no mountain ranges. There were no wrinkles on it. This was actually almost a perfectly smooth ball. In fact, never before had they found anything in the solar system that was this smooth. Odd sort of thing were these like lines and cracks that were running across the surface. That didn't seem to match anything they'd seen before. So they started trying to figure out what they were seeing. Europa is a tiny bit smaller than Earth's moon. So again, this is why I'm saying Earth's moon is something that is like what we normally would find in the outer solar system. So Europa is a little bit smaller than Earth's moon. It gives you an idea of the size. They finally realized those lines running across it are cracks. Now, you know, when water freezes, it often gets cracks in it. Particularly true because when water freezes, it expands. And so if you're making an ice cube, then sometimes if you're making an ice cube in an ice tray, like old-fashioned way of doing it, then if the ice starts expanding, it puts it under pressure and it can actually crack a little bit. And they began to realize that's what they were seeing here. It cracked, and when it cracked, then water would flow up from below into the crack. And the water below was contaminated with stuff. And that brought those colors up there. Well, what was it contaminated with? Well, sulfur, among other things. Sulfur and carbon. And a variety of other sort of things, sulfur and carbon and nitrogen and whatnot. Okay. Now that turned out to be very interesting. Okay. The official term is not cracks. The official term is lineae, which in Latin means lines. Some of these things are up to 20 kilometers across, suggesting that we got quite a lot of activity going on underneath. Inside those cracks, we actually see things that look like ice rafts inside the cracks. And so those ice rafts that are in the cracks, again, indicate that this is something very similar to what we would see if we were to have a crack in sea ice on Earth. Because we see the same sort of thing on Earth, is in the Arctic regions you have a glacier and it cracks, or an ice shelf and it cracks, and then when it freezes over, you get these ice rafts in there. And this gives you an idea how big these ice rafts are. On the right over here are close-ups of some of the ice rafts, and then a feature on Earth here. And so it gives you an idea as to how big these things are. So what happened was astronomers started asking, what does this all mean? Well, the density of Europa was so high that it was pretty obvious that it was mostly rocky in nature, and that the ice portion, which was ubiquitous in these outer solar system things, was actually kind of small. And so it was a very thin layer on the outside. Now, what they were thinking was that this thin layer was a solid, brittle sort of thing on the outside and warm ice on the inside that was circulating kind of like a glacier, kind of like the asthenosphere. This is what we think is happening inside of Ganymede. But the more they studied it, the more they began to realize maybe that's not really what's happening. Maybe what's happening is that underneath this brittle, icy surface is actually liquid water. Okay. Now that's very important, because liquid water at this point, because it's not so deep inside the moon like it is on Callisto, this is not so deep that it's under such pressure. It's unlike on Earth. Now, remember, this thing is smaller than our moon, and so there's much less gravity, which means that the weight of all this water and ice makes a pressure that's really somewhat more than the pressure at the bottom of Earth's oceans. Now, at the very bottom of the Earth's oceans, there's actually things that live there. Not very many things, but there are some things that live there. We've actually found life at the bottom of the deepest trenches on Earth. And so that suggests that it's possible that life forms, such as we know life, not something like totally bizarre, but something that, as we recognize life, could actually survive on Europa, under the surface. Well, could it really do that? So the salty ocean is perhaps 100 kilometers thick. Now that's so thick that an ocean that thick on Earth, the pressure would be like almost unimaginable at the bottom. But remember, Earth has a much higher gravitational field. This is a much, much weaker gravity, which makes it much more reasonable to assume that it's possible that this could be habitable under there with somewhat more pressure than we have on Earth. You know, I don't know that anything living on Earth's ocean would actually make it in there, live, certainly not near the bottom of it, maybe near the top of it. Near the top of it, there actually might be conditions that are similar to near the bottom of the ocean on Earth. But that's interesting. It has a large core, which is molten. We know that from the magnetic response, okay, and a mostly molten fluid mantle. Okay, now that turns out to be very important, that all this molten behavior in here, because that's an interesting sort of thing, because on a world this small, we don't expect it to be molten. In fact, the fact that it's partially molten on Ganymede was a little bit of a surprise, because, like I said, it's between Mercury and Mars in size. We think that you know, maybe it could be molten in there, because we do think there's some molten stuff in Mercury and Mars, but this was like a big surprise that something as small as Europa might be that way. Okay. If it is molten on the inside, you could have volcanic activity, and the volcanic activity at the bottom here of the ocean would warm the water at the bottom of the ocean. It would melt the ice, and then it would circulate. The warm water would rise, and the cold water would sink, and so it would circulate things in there. It would circulate, and it would be just barely above freezing, but it would circulate and move in there. That convection could then crack the surface up here by pushing on it. If you crack the surface, then water could flow in and then freeze up in there. Because those lines have coloration indicating mineral deposits in this water, that means this is probably a very salty, very mineral-rich. Now, why is this important? It's a salty ocean. We think that salt is necessary for life to get some of the electrolytes that you need for life. Organic molecules have been found. Organic molecule is something containing carbon. Okay, there's also indications of nitrogen and these other sort of molecules, other sort of atoms that are essential for life on Earth. The color is sulfur. Sulfur is emitted in certain kinds of volcanic activity. And so that's an interesting sort of thing, which suggests that these volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean on Europa may be spewing out sulfur. Okay, that would be actually similar to the environment on the bottom of Earth's floor near a volcanic vent. And we know that life lives there on Earth, and so what about on Europa? NASA has for many years wanted to send a spacecraft to Europa that would bore through the ice and then drop down and swim to the bottom of the ocean and actually investigate it and actually look for life. They've experimented actually in Antarctica. Because you have the giant ice shelf in Antarctica, and trapped under the ice in Antarctica are actually lakes trapped underneath there. And so they've actually have experimented by actually drilling through and having a spacecraft that bored through the ice, not a spacecraft, but a probe that bored through the ice and studied some of those undersea lakes. Interestingly enough, they actually found life in some of those undersea lakes that have been trapped, separated for tens of thousands, if not millions of years from the rest of the life on Earth. So that was a huge surprise right there. So that suggests that if you get life going, it could actually survive in this environment. Well, so maybe it's like similar to the ocean floor. So is life possible? For most of my career, when you talk about life, we normally talk about life and the conditions for life is based on the sun. We have plants, sunshine, we have photosynthesis. This is how plants gather energy from the sun, the energy necessary for life. Animals then would eat the plants and break down the plant material and use that as energy. And then other animals would eat those animals and break that down and use that as energy. And then things would die, and then other animals would eat that. And so all life pretty much was based on the sun. Even in a deep cave somewhere, nutrients from life living on the outside would filter into it, and that's what life would live on. Bottom of the ocean where the sun never shines. The general feeling was that fish and plankton and so forth swimming in the upper parts would die and sink to the bottom, where bottom feeders would run around and collect the dead things that fell from above and use that as energy source and food for life. Well, that's how we always thought it worked. And then they discovered in the Atlantic Ocean, and then later in the Pacific Ocean and other oceans too, these volcanic vents. And the volcanic vents over here were spewing out sulfurous material. And they discovered a really interesting thing. Some of these volcanic vents had bacteria that were living on the sulfur. They were actually getting chemical energy instead of solar energy to support themselves. Then they found other things were eating those bacteria, and then other things were eating those things, and then small shrimp eating those things, then bigger fish eating the small shrimp, and bigger fish eating things, and then they died and more crustaceans ate them, and there was an entire ecosystem based on the sulfur emissions. No sunlight at all. Well, in that case, that's not overwhelmingly different from possibly the environment at the bottom of the ocean on Europa. And so in that case, it's quite possible that life could live at the bottom of the ocean Europa completely devoid of sunlight, entirely dependent on these volcanic emissions. Now, this is all speculation. We have no indication that this is what's happening. It is speculation, but we've had a lot of talk about life on Mars and massive amount of searching for life on Mars, where the conditions are less habitable than they are on Europa. That would suggest Europa might be a better place to look. Now, the problem is it's underneath kilometers worth of ice, so it'd be very, very difficult to get there to study. But this is something that they would really like to do if they had the money to be able to do it. This is also why when spacecraft that are studying Jupiter or at the end of their life, they're intentionally plunged into Jupiter so they don't accidentally die and fly around and bump into Europa and contaminate it, because Europa could sustain Earth life. We don't want to actually contaminate it accidentally with life that we sent there.